the panel, the discussion, an objective and impartial view of the issues of interest to you. Nation Beat is on now.
Hello and welcome to Nation Beat. This is in fact a very special production of Nation Beat as we mark the Emancipation Celebrations 2024 here in Saint Lucia. And the Government Information Service, in conjunction with the Cultural Development Foundation and the Emancipation Committee, are putting on a series of panel discussions on aspects of emancipation where we are at now in our modern day Saint Lucia. And you may have got our first one. It was an all-male panel. Well, today, this evening, it is going to be an all-female panel and a very rich conversation which we'll be having about afro-ethnicity and how it in fact impacts us here today in Saint Lucia. To my immediate right is Dr. Kenyatta Joseph. She is a lecturer of history, trained historian, and currently teaches and lectures at the University of the Southern Caribbean in Trinidad. And to her right is no stranger to anybody in St. Lucia and perhaps across the world as well. Governor General Emerita, Dame Calliope Pearlette Louisy, formerly as well, many formalities, principal of the South Louis Community College, and of course a great defender of the St. Lucian culture, in particular the Creole language. And another individual to her right who is following her footsteps in that passion, in particular with respect to culture, folk culture and Creole language, is Miss sorry about that, is Miss Joseph. Rhyesa Joseph is in fact a graduate, a valedictorian of the University of the West Indies Caveville campus. She formerly held the directorship at the Folk Research Center here at Barnard Hill in St. Lucia. Ladies, thank you so very much for joining us for this very interesting and timely discussion about Afro-ethnicity and even what that means to many people out there. I think is a good place to start the conversation. Really and truly, Afro-ethnicity, what is that? I mean, is there one African ethnicity to begin with when we think about it? What do we mean when we say black? What do we mean when we say African? What are all those terms really meaning to you? And I won't throw Kenyatta over into the deep end. I've thrown an individual who has some experience in international relations, maybe, who might want to give us a sense of this context of Afro-ethnicity. Rhyesa.
Merci à Pierre, et bienvenue tout le monde encore. Moi, côté pour moi ici, la notion moi afro-ethnicity, ça veut dire. Ça veut dire c'est mon là qui c'est même gay africain. C'est mon là qui sorti en Afrique. Et ça c'est différents pays qui ni de les mêmes cultures et puis même bisaïel là. When we think about afro-ethnicity for us in the Caribbean, it takes on so many diverse elements, because we know that through the transatlantic slave experience, you have persons from the African continent from multiple countries. I know we like to think about Africa as one country, but it is a group of countries forming the continent. And even within certain states like Nigeria, you have multi-ethnic groupings of the Igbo, the Fonds, the Ewe, and they coming together, and these are the groups of persons that are forcibly brought into the region. They share a common homeland. And some of these subgroupings as well share similar cultural groupings. Now, even further afield, when we think about persons of African descent in the Caribbean, they form what is known as part of the African diaspora. And they're joining persons such as African Americans, who form this unit of a kind of Pan-Africanist identity of what it means to be black. And even that is a contested term, because when we look at, for example, the experiences, the philosophies of African Americans, Africans in the Caribbean, those in England and other spaces, we have different distinctions based on our social and political upbringings that often bring us into conflict. But when we look at, for example, a lot of our traditions, they are unifying factors, and even our positions within the society. So when we have Afro-ethnicity, it is both a point of unity and based on where we are based on the experience of migration, the transatlantic slave experience is also a source of conflict.
Thank you so very much for that, Rhyesa. Your Excellency, I mean, you've studied around the world as well and in North America, and I'm thinking that, you hear sometimes from people in North America, well, people from the Caribbean are different from African Americans. They have a different outlook or discipline to them. But let's say we all somehow are getting lumped together, of course, as I don't know what we do, as black people, I suppose, as people of African descent. That term, Afro-ethnicity, what does it mean to you?
Yeah, I did have a bit of a problem trying to isolate, the Caribbean from, the rest of what we call the African diaspora. And in fact, it would appear that the Caribbean is perhaps one of the most diverse regions of the world, at least so I read, as far as ethnicity is concerned. Because you look at the Caribbean and what makes us Caribbean is that we have, the different peoples that have come here. So we have the Amerindians, they were there. I mean, one might argue where did they come from, but they were there. So you have the Amerindians, you have the people from Africa, then you have from Asia, and then you have from Europe. So that when we try to talk about Afro-ethnicity, we don't have to think of, as Rhyesa said, ethnic identities. It's not an umbrella way of looking at where it is we come from. Mm-hmm. So, in fact, I did a bit of research, and I realized there was some, even in particularly in the west of Africa, there's Arab influence, there's Islamic influence, and then from Europe we have British, we have French, we have Portuguese, and the Asian, when we look at our Indian population. So that it is difficult to, to pinpoint what makes the Caribbean, and therefore what is our ethnicity. And so that's an issue, and I think perhaps what we are, we are in the emancipation period, so really we're thinking of, the end of slavery, and we think that slavery, the people came from Africa, but you then have to look at, before they came from Africa, some of them would have come from, other parts of the world. So the issue if we're going to consider ourselves, predominantly Afro, we need to start, learning a little more about Africa, the continent of Africa, so that that might help us understand why we are not as homogeneous a people as we think we are when we talk about being Caribbean or even being West Indian.
Right.
So that has been our issue, and so.
Thank you for gently bringing in that issue about our struggles sometimes, especially within the Caribbean. And Kenyatta, this is a really good point for you to come in, perhaps, because we sometimes think of, the slavery journey, but we even had free Africans, people who came in from the, after emancipation as well. And maybe you may want to talk about that aspect about the diversity of Africa when we speak about Afro-ethnicity.
Yes, thank you. When we're thinking about, Afro-ethnicity and African influences, for the Caribbean, we generally focus on West Africa, Central Africa. But I think something we need to think about is the broad spectrum of time. So yes, we can talk about territories, different states, and so on. But when we're talking about our African heritage and cultural influences, we're talking about from 1600 to now. And how many injections have we had of different African people? So as you mentioned, the liberated Africans, but even prior to that, if we're speaking about the Americas in general, right? Not specifically the Caribbean. Or so we would have had different injections of people, not all of them enslaved, but were Africans. So a lot of sailors were Africans who were on the slave ships, and so they were assisted. So we have those individuals, and they may have had a lot of contact with Portuguese. So the Portuguese were on the West African coast. And so they would have been influenced with Roman Catholicism. So when we are talking about Africanism and African traditions and influences, often what we have is an imagination of what we think African culture is. And so many people will not think about Islam, will not think about Christianity, because it's also what these people identified as. And I like that Rhyesa mentioned the conflict. So we always think it's something unifying, but within the groups there were many separations. And I guess the beauty of the Caribbean is that in spite of this horrible thing, that you had these groups coming together, and I'm sure there were conflicts when people would say, no, mine is better than yours, and this is what we should say and what we should do, because that's what we do where we come from. Or you might be on let's say on an estate which is dominated by a certain ethnic group, and there may have been that kind of conflict. But I guess what I really want to say is that over time we have different injections. So even more recently, we've had more people coming from Nigeria into the Caribbean. And I'm in Trinidad, so I really experienced that. I started seeing more students from Nigeria in my classes. And I know there was this, the medical faculty at UWI, students coming from Botswana. So and we just talk about migration in general. The Syrian-Lebanese conflict has introduced a lot of people from that Middle East, and some of them would have had African influences also. So I think Dame was saying that too, that it's extremely broad, and so what we have to get to is, what do we want to define it as?
But this catch-all Afro-ethnicity or African America, it's a blessing and a curse, I take it, because at least in our part of the world, there is this, when you're doing a census answer, I'm of African descent. But in some parts of the Americas, that's not even an option, especially in the Spanish American countries. There is no definition of ethnicity. And lots of people don't even know their ethnicity to some degree.
But ethnicity can be what we look at, and it can be your practices, your religion, so that is also something. And every 10 years, the census attempts to capture those things, so it keeps on changing. But it's good that it changes also, because how people identify also changes. But you were speaking about, for instance, Brazil. And so, or if we talk about the Dominican Republic, people from the rest of the Caribbean or in the United States get offended when someone who phenotypically looks what we would think of as African does not identify as that. They have an issue. And then you try to explain to them, no, it's the culture. And so that's another part of the ethnicity. How do we identify ourselves?
I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get that answer at this point through this program, but I think we've gotten pretty close to a good understanding of some of the issues and the markers with respect to Afro-ethnicity right here in the Caribbean, in St. Lucia, and in the Americas. But we're going to have to take a break at this point in time. When we come back, we want to dive into a lot more the influences that this ethnicity has actually impacted on us. We'll be right back.
Hello, OECS. Yo, OECS, this is your ocean. If I am to protect your future, we have to work together. It's the time to work together. If I am to help protect your future. Once I used to be so pure and clean, and those hills were so fresh and green. But now you see me as your dumping ground. The current situations has me choking on your pollution. Think hard about it. You will agree that really there is no you without me. Make the zero waste pledge, be responsible. Reduce your waste, recycle where possible. It's down to you, so make the commitment. Recycle for blue oceans and our betterment. Recycle OECS, green actions, blue oceans. For blue oceans and our betterment.
And welcome back to this special production of Nation Beat, a series of panel discussions on emancipation as we try to unpack the importance of emancipation in our current modern context. And we're speaking today about afro-ethnicity. We've got a wonderful panel, Rhyesa, Joseph, Dr. Kenyatta, Joseph, Her Excellency Dame Pearlette Louisy, and an all-female panel giving us a good sense of Afro-ethnicity. But why is it really even important in today's context, I think, is something that we want to delve into very much right now. I mean, one thing that comes to mind immediately, two things: Afrobeats and Nollywood, right? Nigerian movies, they're making their mark around the world. And I mean, even before that, of course, we can speak about the influence of Bob Marley and other individuals of note. Rhyesa, you have a first go at the importance of Afro-ethnicity and the culture impact around the world.
Okay. Before I even speak about Afro-ethnicity, why is it important to know who you are? Is an overarching question that every society tries to answer for itself, because it provides the blueprint for creating a particular kind of citizen, a particular kind of state. For persons of Afro descent, whether it's Afro-Caribbean or Afro-American, this becomes even more important when you look at historical and political structures that have been established, because it is either a source of pride or devaluation. Nusagadi Haiti, epi situation yo même, epi Republique Dominique, to see that being someone of African descent of a particular racial grouping can be a source of disempowerment for some and empowerment. So for us, it is a defining marker as to who you are and also what your value system is, because there are lines that separate the African world, not just in terms of a physical space, but their thought processes, how they see, how they create systems, how they look at economy, family upbringing, development, versus what the Western world sees as a kind of individualistic state. It's me, myself, and I. So it's not just a question that you ask for purpose of identity, but your society and civilization. And for us talking about emancipation in the region, we know that the establishment of a plantation was not just about an economic system, but really dominating who you are by giving you a European idea, European eyes and views of what beauty is, of what intelligence is, and what ideas are allowed to proliferate. So that would be my first take on it. And I'd love to hear what my other panelists would like to say, and I'll jump back in.
Okay, sure, we can do that. Kenyatta, your take on where we're at right now in terms of acceptance of this global impact of Afro-ethnicity, the cultural impact that we're seeing.
So I think when I think about it, I think about the days of Josephine Baker and try to compare it to now. And I think in one thing, I think it still is that Africans and people of African descent are accepted globally in very specific areas still. So it's still going to be in entertainment and it's in sports generally.
So it's still pretty discriminating.
Pardon?
There's still a discrimination on outlook.
So they will accept that. So internationally that is accepted. That you are good entertainers, musicians, athletes, and so on. But even, I guess, even within, well, we would know about people who are good entrepreneurs, who are good leaders, and so on. But we will not hear about those persons who are excelling. And I do remember recently that something came out in, where a new airline will be introduced into the Caribbean. But it's a Haitian businessman. And I remember having this discussion with a friend that, wow, we would not imagine that, right? So someone of partly African descent or wholly African descent, coming from the Caribbean, who is a businessman. These are not the images that we are used to. And when we see those leaders, because I mean, when we think about the musicians and so on, they are seen as leaders also. But there's always some other thing attached to it, like sometimes the bad boy, the rude boy, that sort of thing. So the same kind of respect isn't necessarily given, but I think that's something that I have noticed. I guess so there's still those negative, I wouldn't say negative connotations, but still lacking of respect or seeing people of African descent in those non-traditional spaces. I would say.
Your feel of that, Your Excellency?
I think to some extent what Dr. Joseph is saying is, is so true. I recall, well, my first notion of Africa was from my mother, who used to describe Africa, at least she learned of Africa as the dark continent. Yes. And then, in my, childish mind at the time, I was in dark, couldn't figure out what was dark about Africa. Was it evil? Was it all those unsavory things, or is it? And I came to think afterwards that it's probably the color of the skin color, and that's what was called the dark continent. But with that came all those negative connotations, and so that St. Lucians, or maybe Caribbean people on the whole, are not necessarily very keen on I find, on saying, on being proud of their African ancestry. Yeah, I mean, you don't really hear, it's not a proud African. Now that Africa is coming out, no, I wouldn't say Africa is coming out, but we're going into Africa, we're beginning to understand and to appreciate what Africa is, what contribution Africa has made to, civilization. Generally, not just African civilization, but Western civilization. So now we are looking at Africa with, from a different lens. We do sometimes think that, it's the tribes, the half-savage people. This is what, we grew up thinking of Africa. That is what we were taught. And that's how we were socialized into looking at Africa. But I think there is a change slowly, but even with our, efforts at repatriation or even reparations and so, you want to go back to Africa, what do you want to go and do there? What's there for you in Africa? And that is what we still have, that kind of attitude. So that's why I want to come back to the fact that we need to find ways of showing Africa in its entirety, and move away from the, what we were taught to think of this dark continent of tribes, savages, and so to appreciate particularly their contribution to civilization in academics, in science, in technology, in finance. And when you listen to African leaders talk now, you know they're solid. Mm-hmm. So that is what you know, we should now be proud of seeing ourselves as having that kind of ancestry. And that would as well then boost our own value, the value we put on ourselves, you know, that Africans built, I don't know, pyramids or all the things, you know, finding on the ground, you know.
What are they building today?
What they're building today. And
Right.
but, you know, these things existed long before the West even knew about it, you know. So that is what, I mean, apart from the Afro beats. Now, you know, I'm not too much on the Afro beats section, because, I mean, I really don't know the music. I mean, I have to
Yes.
admit, I don't know a lot of contemporary music. But if that is where we're going to start, it's as good a place as any to start.
Indeed, indeed. Rhyesa, I know you wanted to have another bite at it with respect to these positive images, as Kenyatta was pointing out, especially in beyond the entertainment, beyond the sports. You know, should we not be hearing about the successful African leaders in governance, given the fact that we're always hearing about the bad stuff, you know, then the corruption. You know, should we not be hearing about the successful leaders of Africa, the businessmen of Africa, the Dangotes, for instance?
Oui, moi d'accord pour dire image Afrique ça qui positive nous ni pour ton pli mais qui mané nous ça ton pli si Afrique pas parler pas quoi. A lot of times we have definitions of Africa that are not from Africans themselves, and that's part of the problem. So our establishing history, l'histoire nous ka commencer et puis esclavage, mais Afrique t'es là avant ça. So if it is you don't have a starting point that allows me to tell my story and Kenyatta or Dame is telling about me, then it's going to be a very skewed view. It's going to be based on somebody else's agenda. What is actually going to liberate us from actually seeing more positive images is the knowledge and the research that's actually there, because we know even in terms of various spaces like the Library of Alexandria, when you have the burning of historical records, it does something to distort what you know about yourself and what you can actually tell. When we think about mainstream media, who owns it, how we approach interviewing and painting portraits of Africa, just like the Caribbean, we know we are often stigmatized as just the sand and everybody's on the beach lounging, and we know that's a misconstrued view of our world. The same thing happens for us in the media, and actually going beyond. And it's a responsibility of the media, of our education system as well, to explore and to expand the knowledge we have of other spaces. So, as you rightfully said, the Dangotes, the economic development, the strides made in terms of gender equity, and whether it's Rwanda and the spaces, how they have social systems to protect the elderly. There are so many positive models that are out there, but who searches for them, who tells the story, is always part of the narrative.
I remember in primary school, we had a pen pal. We had a pen pal system, and I had somebody from Truro in Cornwall, in the far reaches of England. Is it time that we should be trying to get more direct people-to-people exchange with Africa and the Caribbean?
Yeah, I was. That's exactly what I was thinking while I was listening to Rhyesa. What I said earlier about Africa being something imaginary, something in our imagination. Part of that is the idea that Africa is so far away. So if you're speaking to young Caribbean children or even older persons, it's a dream to go to Africa. Now, Africa really is very close to the Caribbean, but it's the journey that has to be taken, that and the expense that comes along
Go to
with
Europe
it.
and then come back down.
Yes, that's what makes that distance. And I know part of it is financing and so on, but I think it has remained that way because whenever there have been attempts for some Pan-Africanism, there has been an attempt to break it down. Because we saw it with Marcus Garvey going to the United States and speaking about African culture and Black is Beautiful, when Malcolm X, and so all these people of Caribbean descent who are going over, and there's an attempt to really join these people, and so many people of Caribbean descent had gone to for the independence movement in Africa, being part of the governments and so on. So we have never had that connection with the people. So when we start to get regular flights that are not astronomical in price, I think then we will really begin to have more of that connection, because it's always going to be the price of traveling and getting. Otherwise, it's going to be filtered through Western eyes.
And it's
before
interesting
it
what you're
gets to
saying.
us.
Yeah, and even in terms of how we actually are meeting, you're finding that Caribbean people and African people are meeting usually in Europe or North America, which is where they're gravitating towards.
Yes.
But not in Africa, not in the Caribbean.
Yeah, so that connection to be made again, and I mean, I think that's why Bob Marley was so successful on the African continent. I think that's why Lucky Dube was so successful in the Caribbean, because we still have we had Africa in the Caribbean, and then we had the Caribbean in Africa, and so the meaning for us is so different, but meaning different, like more than it might be for someone else who is not of African descent. So yeah, so as Rhyesa said, when Africa is able to reveal itself, whichever way it happens, but we've never had that direct contact or sustained contact.
I would like to just we've been speaking so far as the Caribbean, looking at Africa and the Africans, but we also need to look at how the Africans, generally, how they see the Caribbean, because it's a two-way thing. I mean, I'm sure a lot of us have heard stories of being in England, and you have quite a few, a lot of persons from Africa there, but they kind of look not too favorably sometimes at the Caribbean, and they see us as slaves. No, we're the descendants of slaves. They are not. So there is this, on both sides, and then needs to be this coming together for us to recognize.
So on both sides, there needs to be this rewriting of our understanding
because,
of each other.
But interestingly though, while I understand that exists at the political level, from both the Caribbean vantage point and Africa, there is the acknowledgement that not just historically, but to foster real development, there must be connection between the Caribbean and Africa, because Africa regards the Caribbean as a pillar of development, as part of the African diaspora that must form part of its development. And equally, we've seen strides in Barbados and in Saint Lucia in recent time of trying to build that connectivity, but as we said, it needs to be sustained, because we cannot pretend that starting fresh from an experience that has been removed for 400 plus years will automatically build affinity. It has to be something that's strategic, something that's deliberate to build that connection and to foster it. And we are aware of the deliberate propaganda sown among generations of Caribbean people to think badly about being Caribbean, much less African, and we don't even know from the African point of view why too there is this deep-seated view of the Caribbean in a particular way, which I cannot speak to. One thing I want to just draw reference to in terms of popular culture, when this movie Black Panther came out, part of the African imagination of dreaming and wishing and seeing it in a particular way, while we in the diaspora loved it, Africans did not believe that it was the right portrait of Africa too. So even then, there's the connection of an imagining of a world that we hope to be in, but we've never been in before.
And we're going to have to do some imagining in the next break, in the next section that we're coming to, but we actually do have to take a break at this point. We'll be right back after this.
No development is possible without change, and Saint Lucia is developing. We are moving on up. That is why we are ready to leave the Privy Council behind and put all our trust in the Caribbean Court of Justice, CCJ. Why CCJ? If you had the choice to pay an exorbitant amount of money to seek justice from the Privy Council, or to go to the CCJ, where it's more affordable and where they could better understand your culture, your values and beliefs, because we are all one people in the Caribbean, which would you choose? Exactly. CCJ belongs to all of us.
And welcome back to Nation Eat. We are talking about emancipation, the importance of afro-ethnicity on our society and our culture. And we're trying to cover so much in this 1 hour. We have not really well, of course, Rhyesa has been speaking in Creole a little bit. But that, I just want to touch about that a little bit, though, about the issue of language, because we still hear quite a lot. It's a broken French. It's a French-based Creole. But we don't quite often underscore that the African aspects of that, underpinning that language, our Creole language.
Voilà, commencer à Creole là, so langue Creole là, qui manière nous pouvons accepter Creole comme langue, ça c'est un bagage nous pour garder, nous garder culture peuple et puis résistance. Là nous te voulons tuer un monde, ou qu'à tuer tout ça qui ça yo. Et puis là nous garder langue Creole là, c'est différents gars africains qui fait, ça c'est une manière pour yo dire, makai accepter langue Léo. N'a commencé faire yon pas comme moi. Et puis dès là nous ka garder nous ka yon des mots sorti un vocabulaire français ça vrai mais là ni différents mots qui ka moucher identité africaine. There are many words in the grammatical system in the Creole language that are African. Now vini I come in. We do not speak English the way we speak it because it is broken. We speak English because it follows an African grammar system. Now, if you've never been educated on the language, then you will feel it's broken because the model of speaking English, and there are many Englishes, if I should say that, American English, British English, and it varies, and even within the United States and England itself, there are variants within that. We are trying to model ourselves over spaces that don't belong to us, that don't take into consideration our identity formats, our unique formations. The Creole language is one of the best representations of African legacies and also resistance. It's also a form of syncretism because to think of people as unintelligent from different African countries and spaces, having to assimilate both the language of different African groups that they live with, and not just one colonizer in Saint Lucia, but two, that is a sign of brilliance. And then we see throughout the Caribbean as well that have Creoles of similar make, that it is a language of resistance. Now, our education has not taken it further afield to now say that we now want to embrace the fact that we are bilingual, and bilingualism is a form of intelligence. Unless we are able to do that and legislate it, we continue to face some of the continued stigmas, a lot of them propaganda that was based in saying that persons who speak Creole, you're pas intelligent. You say, je ababois, pas cosa nou te ka di avant. Or because we were the ones that were able to go through formal education and do well, that those persons who were Creole speakers taught in English, who didn't do well because they didn't get certification, were unintelligent. We have not realized the form of discrimination and exclusivity that we've actually practiced, even in an independent Saint Lucia at present. When you think about national broadcasting in Saint Lucia, là nous commençons à regarder nouvelles privées ou ici à SOGIS, qui manière ou pas kaitan Creole. Agostom ko berel ka vinu pas kaitan Creole. Mais tout partout aller Creole ensemble nous et en musique nous, mané nous ka parler puis on a l'autre, ou pas ça aller pièce côté pas tant langue Creole là, mais en même temps il parle langue officielle ici. And that's still part of the emancipation process today that we have to break, but it is strategic and deliberate to keep it at a stage where it is not a formal language, it is not recognized, not even in our parliament unless you translate it. We still have to do a lot of work.
And spoken in Africa as well. And
yes,
in
it is. Yes, yes.
But I mean, there's so much in that aspect, and I expect we may have to have a full program on just that aspect of it.
Yes.
But that whole issue of what are the practical steps that we can do in terms of reimagining our Afro-ethnicity, the opportunities that we are missing out on by not embracing that Afro-ethnicity. That's what I want to try to focus on for the minutes that we have left at this point. Now, Kenyatta, I mean, you've been speaking quite a bit about this aspect of it and some of the practical steps that we've seen, maybe in terms of education and the Botswanan program. So should more of that be happening, perhaps cultural exchanges with Africa, with other places within the diaspora as well, the African diaspora?
I think it should just be happening with everywhere. But unless we have we have a conversation and agreement as to how we want to see Saint Lucia go culturally, and whether we want infusions directly cultural, but could be otherwise because we're talking about ethnicity, coming in, and we want to cultivate that, then, but we're not ready, we're not having those kinds of conversations. And in terms of the practicality, so yes, I think generally when we started the conversation, we're talking about culture. But when we think about culture, we kind of limit it, but we have a culture of business, finance. So are we speaking about those things? And of course, there's use for bringing those things in. And I was just thinking, not necessarily the practicality of it, but when Rhyesa was speaking about the language, and I guess in promoting it as, you know, something that's not broken, that we should be proud of. When I was doing my research, I was so happy to see this and recognize this, where one government official, in referring to the Creole, an English official was complaining that most of the planters only spoke French Creole and a few of them spoke French. And for me, that spoke volumes, because it meant that even though those estate owners were of European descent, but they were Creole, they were living in Saint Lucia, that their main way of communication was French Creole. And when we talk about the resistance of the language, but also now it being accepted by those persons who are seen as the pillars of the society, it meant so much for me as a researcher, as a St. Lucian. And I think when we go into the history and we see those kinds of things, I think it will assist us in claiming the kind of resilience and the pride for the language. And of course, when we talk about ethnicity, we are talking about language. But language then is how you live, which is your broader life. And I think other aspects of African culture, you know, that came to St. Lucia will get greater resonance with the rest of the population.
It's part of our challenge now to begin pivoting away, keeping our eyes not just looking north, but actually looking towards Africa. From an economic perspective, I mean, we're hearing, for instance, that Africa is going to be, well over the largest growth in population in the world is coming from Africa over the next 100 years. This is where you're going to see lots of growth in economic development. Is there not a wonderful opportunity for economic development and from the Caribbean looking to Africa? Dave, I don't know if you want to have a little bite at that one.
Economics?
Right, it's really economic.
So why not?
Yes, in fact, we are seeing, you know, already this movement. We have for example, the exactly. You know, all those, I know that there have been some persons from the Caribbean who who scoff at it, and what does Africa have to offer? Are these people, serious? And then we do talk about, corruption and all that. But I think that's where it's at. If as Kenyatta said, is Kenyatta?
Yeah.
Oh, I said Kenyatta, and then I thought of Kenyatta. I thought, well, maybe I'm seeing ghosts. We need to decide where we want to put ourselves as far as culture and ethnicity moving forward. Who are we? And that is something that a question and a decision that we as St. Lucians and perhaps as Caribbeans generally need to take. Who are we? Where do we see ourselves situated? The West, the West in that sense, or the North. But if we see ourselves as ethnically linked to Africa, then it gives us something to work with. What kinds of attitudes, what kinds of things we would like to see of a St. Lucian or of a Caribbean person. And so if we agree that that is where we see that we perhaps belong, in the sense that that's where we came from, then that collaboration, that cooperation would be, so much easier for people to swallow, if you want, or for people to accept that, we're going back. Everybody now is kind of going back to where they came from, because we understand the importance of hereditary ancestry. If that is, where our ancestors come from, this is who we are as a people. I think now is the time to strengthen those initiatives, but we need to decide who we want to be. Excellent point, Dame Pearlette. And coming to you, Rhyesa, this whole issue of embracing that opportunity. I think I'm seeing it. We saw a little bit of it for Carnival this year. Some of the choices of social influencers, I realized, were coming from Haiti, from Nigeria. This recognition that, look, this is our market now that we can actually begin to tap into.
Interesting that you would say that, because in our discussion prior to coming live on set, we were reflecting, and I was reflecting on the Emancipation mural that was the backdrop of Petroni Duane, and the fact that even the revelry of Carnival, modern Carnival present, to a celebration of what being emancipated was like in the past, was like future with past and present all in one. And connecting what you're asking me some of the previous questions, I think we already have the answer. Not necessarily looking west or east, but looking within. There are a lot of traditions, Carnival included, that have elements that are Afrocentric in their base, in how you dance and move your body, the music that you connect to, the fact that whether it is a Haitian or someone of Nigeria who comes in and can feel that they are at home, because it's not easy to come into a space and assimilate, and that in and of itself is a testimony. But as you spoke even broader in terms of social and economic development, we have a lot of practices within our Saint Lucian community. And I want to say, for me as a researcher, we have two Saint Lucias. We have the Saint Lucia that operates in the formal political space that is dominated by a lot of Western ideals and views, but Saint Lucia in practice at the community level is very African in its orientation. And what do I mean by that? You have a lot of systems, whether you look at SUSU or a credit union system, that mirror African economic systems. They're ROSCA, rotating saving systems, that are similar, and that is not accidental. You have your own forms of understanding what is medicinal healing for you. It is environmental, that is connected to an African kind of environmentalism. Koun men pa sorti an ciel la, I sorti an affaire Afrique, because there's a communal understanding that individual development is not separated from the family and the local community. And these are legacies that we know exist, but we have not spent time to understand how and the why. It happens, and it's formed part of a lot of important growth, whether it's our first indigenous bank being formed out of that kind of movement, but we have to make the connections. And when you know who you are from the inside out, then you can make the connections in a way that is organic, it's authentic, and it's not being pushed by what does the market see.
Thanks for that, Rhyesa. Now, I want to come back to a point just as we end, which is what Dame Pearlette raised. This one of these barriers of, are we really the same person? Like, an African seeing a Caribbean person come in, who are you? 400 years later, and you're saying that you're my brother. Creating that real connection. And I'm just wondering, we have the science now. We have DNA testing. We have Ancestry.com and 23andMe. Is that something that we need to really be pushing a lot more, maybe even at a national level, to begin getting our very own individuals to realize that, look, they actually came from a particular place. They may actually have family members that they can actually trace and identify with in Africa? Kenyatta, I'm looking at you deliberately because you're the historian.
Yeah, because I myself, I keep on saying I'm going to get one of those DNA tests. And of course, the DNA test works with as many more people get into the database, then they can identify. But generally, we would know that we are from some part of West Africa, and so on. So yes, that is a great way to get people to begin making that connection. I think a lot more funding needs to go into our national archives. A lot more fun. That is where we should start.
Especially in the wake of what just happened in Barbados.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is where we should start, but the money isn't going there. So that because we need to save the documents that we have, what's available, we need to be able to maintain them. Every time I haven't been there in a while, they might be missing me, I haven't, but every time I would go to the National Archive, people will go in there, generally St. Lucians, to figure out their lineage, but related to land. And what we want people to do is in terms of their heritage, in terms of their family, we would like that to happen. And I think that needs to happen even before the DNA, because the DNA will just tell you you're from West Africa, somewhere in West Africa. Maybe you have some European, some Indian or Asian, influences. But it's been so difficult for us because, the lack of documentation, and not just, the archives not being supported, but, we had 2 fires which destroyed our information. Some of our information is located in France, in Martinique, whatever, because of the way St. Lucia was administered in Barbados and so on. And so yes, DNA is wonderful to go and find out bloodline. But in terms of your heritage, your name, we have to make the links to the past, and then we can make the move across. And so if we start with the DNA, I don't think it will bring us, the way it will bring us there is that people have that feeling
that they need
like they belong.
Yeah.
And the connection has been made.
Wonderful, wonderful indeed.
Perhaps I could just add, put on my reparations hat there. One of the CARICOM's 10-point plans is teaching or bringing Africa and the Caribbean together. The whole idea of assistance in building up those institutions that would tell us about our culture, our heritage, and also the making it easier for whether it be in the beginning researchers or persons who are interested in repatriation can go, facilitate the movement out there so that they can see for themselves, feel for themselves, and then come back, and tell us what they saw, what they experienced. Because if not, we might still think, oh, mate, he just come in and say that. He didn't actually see, which is what because this is now we're finding out that mate or whoever it is just came and told us this is this, and now we're finding out that that's not true. Yeah. So yes, I think we need to the CARICOM needs to come together to make that connection easier, and also those who sort of kept us away from who we were and who we are should, I know some of them don't want to apologize for what they did, but at least in the place of not in the place of apology, if you don't, but still do little things that would show that, well, yes, you acknowledge that there has been a wrong committed, and even if we start there, bringing us back, helping us go back, so that we understand who we are, where we came from, that would be a step in the right direction. And people who, many people say, forget this thing about slavery, this is past, let's look at the future. But you don't have, what kind of a future you have if you're not aware of what your past is? You might just end up being, enslaved again.
A very fitting way to end our program. Thank you so
Since
very much for that. And of course, and you may have a spot in Nollywood, I understand. You're great acting in Shanty's world. You've been doing so much to, in fact, help us to better understand our story. And I want to thank each of you profusely for really, really giving us a wonderful insight for today. Rhyesa, Joseph, Kenyatta, Joseph, and of course Dame Pearlette, Louisy, thank you very much for sharing with us today. This has been another wonderful program of Nation Beat, and of course it's a special series looking at emancipation as we mark Emancipation 2024 here in St. Lucia. It's been a production of the Government Information Service in collaboration with the Cultural Development Foundation, and we do hope that you have a wonderful day.